right? So that's a really important piece to note there right now, that any content that anyone sees on Facebook can be reported to us. And we do the best we can to look at those user reports and weigh and check them against our community standards. The next is we have human review by our own internal people, right? And by a number of 40,000 people around the globe that are reviewing content that's reported by users, and that also we flag ourselves proactively. The people that review this content are looking at content that can be, in some cases, rather easy to make decisions on. If you're talking about content that is involving terrorism, graphic violence, child exploitative imagery, those kinds of things, you can get to decisions pretty quickly and pretty easily about taking those down. When you're talking about content that is more political speech in nature and is a little more blurry in terms of a certain nuance, then we're talking about content that really needs a larger and more specific focus, and we really try and make sure that there are people reviewing those that are very highly trained in our policies, and also, of course, the local context of the content and where it's coming from and where it's being delivered to. The same type of speech in one country, as I mentioned before, could be benign, but in the context of a different country and a different situation, it might be malevolent, right? And so we balance those very clearly by having humans review content that is flagged by different sources. And the kind of way that we really moderate content at real scale, because again, we're talking about billions of pieces of content every day, is by artificial intelligence and the machine learning that we've developed over many, many years. People now look at Meta as an artificial intelligence company, but the truth is that we have been an artificial intelligence company for many, many years already. And one of the ways that we've used artificial intelligence for a long time now is in order to moderate content at scale. And so what we do is we train what we call classifiers to look at our community standards and look at the content that's posted on our platforms and weigh those pieces of content against our community standards. And that's how we tend to moderate content really at scale. And like I said, for things like imagery that's clearly graphically violent, or clearly includes terrorism content or child exploitative imagery, those artificial intelligence systems are very effective and work very well to proactively remove content that can be dangerous and illegal in many countries around the world. And so we have these three ways that we moderate content, right? We have the artificial intelligence that's operating in scale and very much again, and I want to stress this, in local language, in Tagalog. It absolutely has that capability. And then we have a series of 40,000 people around the world that are humans that are trained in our community standards, and then we also rely on user reports. And it's those three main pillars that help us enforce our community standards. Next slide, please. Now, it's also important to recognize that there are a couple different ways you can moderate content. You can look at individual pieces of content, and that's very important, especially when it comes to user reports and anything that our machine tools are catching. But there's also the ways that we can look at disrupting entire networks of abusive actors, right? And so what we might look at when we talk about abusive networks are networks of people that are distributing child exploitative imagery, or like I said, terrorism content, or more recently we've looked at scam networks, right? We've looked at misinformation and disinformation networks. And in these cases, what you're talking about are a group of people that are intentionally coordinating their behavior to violate our policies. Often, in many cases, doing so by lying about who they are or being dishonest about who they are in the process, right? And so when we look and we see and we find evidence of these types of abusive networks, we have special policies in place that can also remove content at the network scale, right? And so when you think about that, then you're looking at removing content not just on a piece-by-piece basis, not just on a page-by-page or profile basis, but in a series of accounts, right? And so if you're talking about, examples where we might see a few hundred accounts or a few thousand accounts engaged in coordinated abuse of our platforms, then you're looking at the potential to remove all in one swoop, thousands or even sometimes hundreds of thousands and millions of pieces of individual content, right? And that's an incredibly effective tool that we use against criminal networks, and also in cases where we find there to be specific misinformation, disinformation campaign and foreign interference networks. At this stage, before I get to the next part about some of that work, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Rob Abrams from our law enforcement team. He's going to specifically talk about some of the work that we do in collaboration with Philippines law enforcement and the very close relationship that we have with them. Well, and then I'll continue. Thanks a lot, Rob.
Thank you, Rafi. So I want to talk a little bit in a bit more depth, but not with a level of granularity that would afford our adversaries any sort of unnecessary insight into the obstacles that we put up. But I want to talk in a little bit more depth about the network disruptions that we do. They're very strategic in in nature. They're not merely about scale and taking down 10,000 accounts at one time. They're about removing a false web of bona fides that these criminals go to great lengths to create so that they can contact people unwittingly by seemingly being friends of friends or having other sorts of connections. A lot of the work we do, especially here in the Philippines, is informed by the signal sharing and by the data requests we get from agencies like NBI, from the Office of Cybercrime, from CICC, from the Anti-Cybercrime Group at the PNP, others. So a lot of the work that we've been able to do, I say this under oath, and I say this with a lot of passion. The Philippines has been seriously global leaders when it comes to helping us fight forced criminality and these scam centers, formerly known as POGOs, if you like, that operate here in the Philippines, target not only Filipinos, but are engaged in human trafficking, forced criminality, and are a large part of the scam and increasingly misinformation ecosystem that, again, have a big role here. I think there's one advantage that I'd like to point out, and I know it sounds perhaps a bit counterintuitive. Here in the Philippines, we know that scam centers operate, but we also know that law enforcement and the government here takes them very seriously. There are geopolitical black holes that we all know of, where law enforcement has no appetite to actually combat this. But because we have such a good relationship with PNP office, anti-cyber ACG, with the NBI, with various task forces, we are able to ingest signal regularly. I can say again, under oath, there's probably not a day that goes by where I'm not in contact with a member of Philippines law enforcement. So with that, and I'm quite certain I'll receive some follow-up questions and as we go forward. With that, I'll turn back over to Rafi. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Rob. And it was just worth noting that Rob himself is a former member of the FBI, and so takes his law enforcement work very seriously.
Just correction for the record, sir.
Sorry.
Homeland Security.
Homeland Security Department. Forgive me. So I would just also note that when we're talking about some of these disruptions, what we've seen also recently, and Rob alluded to this, is the rise of scam centers, right? And we've worked on this very, very closely over the past couple of years, both internally with Meta and also with our partners in law enforcement, with the PNP and other members of the Philippines law enforcement that Rob mentioned. It's really worth noting that I think it's kind of clear at this point that what we see are these transnational criminal syndicates that are operating in a couple different countries around Southeast Asia and indeed globally. And they engage in forced criminality, human trafficking, and then, of course, the real horrible element of this is that not only are people forcibly trafficked to these locations, but then they're forced to engage in further crime and scams against other people. And so we've worked extremely hard to take down these networks on our platform to the point where by the end of 2024, we had removed and deleted over 2 million accounts that came from these organized criminal scam centers. in Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, the UAE, and indeed a few here in the Philippines as well. Thanks very much to our collaboration with Philippines law enforcement.
I'd also like to just add for the record, the Filipino law enforcement community, as well as the BICAM in general, were among the first globally to flag this as a national security threat. So that has really sort of stepped up the tempo of our work and the investments we're doing around this work. So I just want to publicly acknowledge the law enforcement agencies, the military agencies, the regulatory agencies, and indeed members of the BICAM, who have been among the world leaders in flagging this not only as an economic threat to individual Filipinos, but as a national security threat here in the Philippines and globally. Of course, I don't want to get too granular on that, but the law enforcement agencies, and I'm sure your good self, Mr. Chair, are aware of exactly what I'm speaking of. If there are further, more granular conversations that you'd like to have around that, Mr. Chair, I, of course, would be honored to do that in executive session. And we have a great relationship with your law enforcement agencies and CICC. We held a conference in November in Bangkok, largely closed door and held under Chatham House rules. Filipino law enforcement were among sort of the flagship entities that were there. NBI spoke, PNP spoke, the PNP attaché in Bangkok spoke. He's been a fantastic advocate and source of trend sharing. So I just want to express gratitude for helping shape the narrative on how serious of a threat this is to the global infrastructure. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And if we can go to the next slide, I'd like to address how we specifically deal with misinformation on our platforms. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay. Mr. Chairman, I mentioned earlier how there are some of our community standards which are actually fairly easy to enforce. The bans on terrorism, child exploitative imagery, these kinds of things, graphic violence in some cases. Then there are topics that are much more difficult, right? And much more highly nuanced and very contextual. And misinformation tends to be, not always, but tends to be more in that second bucket of more difficult types of content to moderate. So because of that, and for various other reasons, we have a three-pronged approach to how we treat misinformation. Number one, we remove the most harmful misinformation that can lead to offline physical violence. Number two, we reduce the distribution of misinformation if it is found to be false by one of our third-party fact checkers, and then we will reduce that misinformation on our platforms so that people are less likely to engage with it. And number three is we seek to inform. If people have engaged with misinformation on our platforms, we want them to be informed that they have indeed done so. We want them to know that they have maybe unintentionally shared misinformation. And we want them to have access to authoritative sources of information. So those are our three-pronged processes, right? Remove the most harmful that can lead to physical violence, reduce other types of misinformation that may not lead to physical violence, and inform our community. I should also mention, and this is obviously very, very important in the context of the election cycle that we're also in. There's another type of misinformation that we will outright remove, and that is misinformation on elections, right? And so if there is misinformation specifically about electoral procedures, about the date the election is going to take place, the way you cast a ballot, those are other types of misinformation that we will outright remove from our platform. What's important to recognize, and I'll go to the next slide here, is how we determine the differences between what we remove, what we reduce, and how we inform, right? So please go to the next slide. At Meta, and indeed, I think most digital platforms take the same approach where we want to be very careful about being the arbiters of truth, right? In many ways, in many aspects, we feel that that's a responsibility that that is too great for us to have, and can lead to situations where we're trying to make determinations that we're just not qualified to make about what is true and what is false. And as you might imagine, trying to police misinformation at the scale of more than 3.2 billion people every day would become practically impossible, right? And so what we do is we work with third-party fact checkers in more than 60 languages around the world. These third-party fact checkers are non-governmental organizations that are certified by the International Fact Checking Network, the IFCN. That is how and that's how they are certified. And so what we do is, when we are made aware of a potential piece of misinformation, that piece of content will be enqueued to the third-party fact checkers themselves. In Philippines, we work with 3 third-party fact checkers. We work with Verifiles, Rappler, and AFP. And they are very active fact checkers, I should say. And then we wait for, and while that content is enqueued, then it's up to the third-party fact checker to determine whether that content is indeed false, or there are other cases, right? You can imagine that misinformation isn't just binary. It's not necessarily true or false entirely. There are cases where it can be partially false, it can be misleading, it can be lacking context, right? So there are a number of different ratings that fact checkers can apply on our systems, and those ratings will lead to different actions by Meta's platforms, right? But in a case where a rating is rated false, then that content will be reduced in distribution and will have a label applied to it, so that the people who potentially see that content can click on the label and read for truth or for authoritative information from the third-party source, right? And so that's our general approach to how we would treat misinformation when it would not be specifically physically lead to specific physical violence or lead to to misinformation on the elections process, right? Now, in a case, like I said, where a third-party fact checker not only clarifies that it's false, and we get additional signal that it can lead to violence, or additional signal that this could clearly impact the ability of people to have the access to information they need to properly access the electoral process, then we can outright remove the information. But that is not, those, I just want to emphasize that the outright removals of misinformation are much more limited in scope. I would also just like to note that, if we see that there are repeated violations, or sorry, I shouldn't say violations, if there are repeated instances of misinformation from the same people, from the same pages, then that can lead to overall less distribution of the content by those people and by those pages. And it can lead to other actions such as demonetization, the prohibition on placing ads, and so forth, right? So there are a number of kind of increasing scale of penalties that can be applied if you're a repeat purveyor of misinformation on our platforms. I think we have an example. If the next slide, please. Right. So here's just one example of a fact check on our platform. This was a fact check of a claim that a blogger made that the Philippines had used water cannons against the Chinese Coast Guard. This was false. This was rated false by our fact checkers. And you can see on the left, this is the actual fact check. And on the right, this is how the content would now appear on our platform with a screen over it, right, and a warning along with the label that explains that this is false content, right? And again, this would also be content that is reduced in distribution, and so even getting to that content would be much less likely on the part of any user using our platforms. I think the last thing I would just like to say is on the topic of misinformation is, there can also be misinformation networks that are doing this with intentionality. We put out a threat report, I believe, every quarter, where we go through globally the types of actions we've taken against networks. Right, I mentioned a number of actions we've taken recently against scam networks and transnational criminal networks in 2024. That was included in one of our threat reports. But it's public information. You can go online and access this information, and we have taken down a number of networks over the years in Philippines for many different reasons, not just because of their misinformation. We've seen scam networks. We have seen misinformation, disinformation networks. Those are all publicly reported in our threat report. And again, we have done this in collaboration with local law enforcement, so that when we're made aware of, and our investigators internally can confirm that there are misinformation networks that are operating on our platforms, we will take those down. And Mr. Chairman, I've gone on for quite some time explaining our content moderation policies and the basics of our misinformation policies. I think Rob has added to that with some color around the very close collaboration that we have with law enforcement in the Philippines. I know there's a lot of questions that you and the committee want to answer, and I'm very happy to take those now with a lot of gratitude. And I want to emphasize this point: a lot of gratitude we have to you and the committee for giving us the space to be here to talk to you and the Filipino people about these very important issues. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Rafael. We will now proceed to the interpolation with regards to the meta issue. The first to interpolate will be Honorable Franz Castro.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I also thank the Meta for coming here after 3 notices. Thank you. I have some specific personal question about how the Meta is detecting community standards violation, or what you call violation of community standards. When you look at when you look at your platform, we have here several. When you report like a content, you will find here several violations like scam, fraud, or impersonation, unauthorized political ad, adult content, selling or promoting restricted items, violence, hate, or exploitation, bullying or unwanted content, intellectual property, suicide or self-harm, false information, problem involving 18-year-old or someone under 18 years old. Well, I was a victim of your platform, where my official Facebook account were taken down by your platform due to it said there impersonation. So I cannot understand why do you take down an account due to impersonation. So how does it happen? So how will you determine that really is this account is impersonated? Because this account was reported to COMELEC as my official election account for for my daily activities during election.
Thank you, Madam Congressman. Mr. Chair, if I may. Madam Congresswoman, thank you for your question.